and welcome again to Talking Sunday Readings. Thank you for joining us once again. My name is Tim Carter, and I'm joined by Ann Carter and by Pastor Dick Stadler. And we're going to be talking about the readings that you might hear in church services this coming Sunday. And they are going to be Acts chapter 5, verses 12 to 20 and 21 to 32. Revelation chapter 1, verses 4 to 18. And finally, a gospel lesson from the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verses 19 to 31. We're going to kick things off here with a couple of questions. The reading from Acts describes the apostles after Jesus, after his resurrection. And it takes place in an area that, at least my translation calls it Solomon's Colonnade. And I'm wondering, where exactly is Solomon's Colonnade? If we could just get a little bit more of a context or a picture of where that is and where that takes place. This is also a famous story involving the apostles being jailed, and they are let out of jail. And the guards went to get the prisoners out of jail, and they find that they're missing. And I'm wondering, what do we know about jails at this time? What did they look like? I have a very modern interpretation of what a jail is, of, bars and you can see into it. So I'm wondering, how did they not look in there and see that there wasn't anybody there? I'm also wondering, how could they have walked out without any guards noticing or seeing these apostles leaving? So those are my questions, and I'll leave it up to you to take it in any order that you'd like, or just leave them all there. Maybe none of those have answers.
I'm willing to start with the question about Solomon's Porch, because I've got some pictures that just might help people visualize what they're going to hear about this Sunday. And if I can just get to the slideshow. There we go. Can you see those pictures?
Yep.
This is what Jerusalem looks like today. This is the Kidron Valley that you hear a lot about in the New Testament. This is the Mount of Olives. And across the Kidron Valley from the Mount of Olives is Temple Mount. And so in Jesus' day, we think the temple looked something like this. It had 4 walls that were all colonnaded. They were covered and they had columns in them. And so there was a lot of meeting area in those. And there was a lot of different ways to get into the temple in Jesus' day. You had to hold the gates on the south side of the temple, and then you had 4 different gates on the western side of it, and then you had 1 gate coming down from the Mount of Olives that you could get in. So depending on who it was that was coming in, all of them could come in. Now, if you went up Robinson's Arch, which is right on the corner of Temple Mount in the south west corner, you would immediately enter what's called the Royal Stoa. And people, you can see how much room there is there. This was extremely high, 75 feet high. And so clusters of rabbis and their disciples could gather in between the columns. And this is on the south end of the temple arrangement. This is the Royal Stoa here. And the eastern wall was called Solomon's Porch. And there was also a northern wall with columns, and people could meet there, and then the western wall. And so if people came in, they would not, if they were not Jews, they couldn't go beyond this barrier right here. It's all went all the way around. And there was a threat of death if you were a non-Jew and trying to get past that. But you can see from this visualization of the Royal Stoa and the other colonnaded walls may have been giving them as much room as this. So if they met in Solomon's Porch, that would be right here. And directly from Solomon's Porch, they could go right out into the courtyard. And if they were Jews, they could go into the court of the women and offer their sacrifices and their prayers and so forth. So it was a very handy location. And the Solomon's Porch here is on the east, the western wall's on the opposite side, and there's the Royal Stoa on the south. And there are 3 things that we're told in the scriptures happened in the Solomon's Porch. Jesus was asked by the Jews if he is the Messiah, and that was in John 10:23. And then in Acts 3, we're told a healed cripple finds Peter and John in the Solomon's Porch. And then we have the reading for today where Christians are gathered here in Acts 5:12. And so it was a safe place, as safe as any place could be after the ascension of Jesus, where clusters of Christians could get together because there was a lot of space and they would look like other groups of rabbinical disciples that were gathered around their leaders. And so that's the end. Any questions about the pictures or anything? Does that help?
No, that paints
visualize where it might be.
Yeah, paints a nice picture. Yeah.
Let me stop sharing then. There.
Very good.
And maybe Ann, you'd like to attack the other question.
Yeah, if there's anything, either of you have any insights about prisons and what they were like, or really how did they get out without being seen?
Well, we know that there were probably at least 4 different areas in the city of Jerusalem where people could be held. One of them was Antonia Fortress. That was Roman fortress, and that was if you were in Roman custody. Then there was, I don't have my book with me now. There were 3 others. There was in the temple itself. There was a place that they might hold people. We think that Jesus was held in Caiaphas's house. And there's also what's noted here is as a public jail, because if you weren't arrested necessarily on religious grounds or on a charge against Rome, what were you to do? They were not, as we know of a standard staff of a sheriff and deputies, etc. And if you were put in jail, such a place, you were responsible for yourself. There wasn't food, there wasn't water. You were put away until you could get tried. In the case of the disciples, since they were arrested by the Jewish authorities, it is quite likely that it was close to the temple, even if it wasn't on temple grounds, so that they could easily be brought in for trial by the Sanhedrin. There were also 3 different places where the Sanhedrin might have had a location that they would hear trials, that they would adjudicate. As for why the guards didn't know, that is a theme that gets repeated a few times in the New Testament, that somehow Paul, Peter, James, others get arrested, they're set free. The jailers are either knocked out and they don't know what happened, or they're completely oblivious to it. Somehow it is a miraculous event. Obviously, an angel comes and lets them out, tells them to go back and start preaching again. That's the only explanation that I have for it. Why else wouldn't you, if you were put as a guard? We know that there were temple guards. We know that there was a contingent that was organized by the Sanhedrin. We also know that there were Roman guards. So there is not a police force as we know it, but certain people would have been assigned to the task by local leaders and authorities. How was that? Was that any kind of an answer?
No, that helps. That makes sense. Yeah.
And also, it's kind of ironic here. I think maybe Luke is being ironic when he adds the detail that an angel released them, because the people who had put them in prison were Sadducees who did not believe in the existence of angels. And
really?
So I wonder if Luke isn't being highly sarcastic here, or ironic, but we have to know that. And this is after Peter has been used by God or by Jesus to heal some people, and people were laying on cots and mats and hoping that just his shadow might fall on them. Now, what's interesting in the text is it doesn't say that they were healed. They desired to be healed, and maybe the presence of that statement without anything else said about it is supposed to imply that, yeah, and they were all healed. What we do hear later in verse 16 is that they were all healed, those who came to them with sicknesses and unclean spirits. But in the previous verse, in verse 15, all we're told is that the people hope to have the shadow of Peter heal them, and we're not told if that was actually happened. But
What I thought was interesting in verse 13 is that they were widely respected, the apostles. But in verse 13, it says no one else dared join them.
Yeah.
So the apostles were preaching, but nobody had the courage. And so they wouldn't bring their people to Peter and to the other disciples, but they would lay them there just in hopes. It's an interesting testament to our belief that it will work, but our fear of coming out and declaring it openly. And then, after we find out later that people they're sick from all over, from all the outskirts of Jerusalem, brought them in. And when they brought them into the presence of the apostles, then they were healed. And in verse 17, I thought this was interesting as well. The Sadducees, the high priest, his associates, they were all filled with jealousy. How often do bad things happen because leadership feels inadequate and insecure and gets jealous of truth, and terrible things happen. You arrest the wrong people, you put them in jail, I just thought it was crazy. Go bring them here. They're the ones who are in power. And the guards say, well, you know what? They're doing exactly what you told them not to do. They're out there preaching. That's great story. Great story.
And the effect of Pentecost is having its ripple effects on here in their lives, because they are gutsy. They've been put in prison, and the angel brings them out and says, go back to the temple where you were arrested and keep preaching. And they do it at the break of day. They don't hesitate. They don't wait. And they're preaching some more. And then they're called before the religious leaders. And that's where they say the very great message: we must obey God rather than men. And verse 29. And then they don't play how to win friends and influence people with the religious leaders. They accuse them of being the ones responsible for hanging Jesus on a tree. Now, we know technically it was the Romans who did it, but it was them. It was the religious leaders who orchestrated that and accomplished it. And the whole point of his being hung on a tree, Peter says, is to give repentance to Israel and forgiveness of sins. So I have to believe that there's an implied invitation to those religious leaders right then and there, that they've got a chance, if they would only repent, to have forgiveness for what they did. We're not told that they responded positively to that, but that's what they do. Anything else?
I don't have any other questions. If anybody has any other thoughts before we move on.
I thought maybe I was in a different text. I thought there was a text here where Peter gives the credit not to himself for healing these people, but to the Lord. And I think that's a reinforcement of the theme of the book of Acts, which is not the acts of the apostles. It's the acts of the risen Lord through his church, through his apostles. And in every one of these cases, we're going to see when they do miracles, that it's because Jesus' power is still alive, because he's resurrected and now he's working through his church. And they don't take the credit themselves. They maybe it's going to come up in our gospel reading. So we'll see. Okay.
Well, let's move along then and see what the next couple readings have, and maybe that's where we're at. So moving on then to Revelation. This is quite a vivid description and quite an interesting picture that it paints. Maybe it's easiest just to read some of this description, because it is quite something. I'm going to start here, Revelation on verse 12. I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, and when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And that's what my translation describes them as. And among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, and with a golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and coming out of his mouth was a sharp double-edged sword. His face was like the sun shining in all its brilliance. Boy, that is quite a description. And I'm wondering what does it all mean? To start, why is there a sword coming out of his mouth? I guess I understand some of the symbolism there, but why the sword? Why the lampstands? And then I suppose ironically, not ironically, but after reading that description, the first thing he says is, "Do not be afraid." I'd be afraid if I saw that. I mean, he's holding up all this stuff and he's got a sword coming out of his mouth. Anyway, what can we learn from this vivid description, and what should we be looking for when we hear it in church?
Well, I'll start out and say one of the first things to always remember is that Revelation is a vision, and so it's symbolic. And in our Western culture, we don't always understand all the symbols.
Yeah,
I think that goes without saying. 7 is a perfect number. 7 is completeness. So there are 7 lampstands, there are 7 stars, there are 7 spirits to the 7 churches. This is a completion of the mission of Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, who accomplished what he set out to accomplish. My last comment, and Dick, you know so much more about Revelation than I do, is that a double-edged sword cuts both ways. It is good, it is bad. And Jesus, as the Word made flesh, in his words, he has judgment and he has peace to offer to the world. That's how I translate that vision of power and inexplainable energy and completeness, and now either look out or be. He doesn't want us to be afraid, but there are many who will be afraid because of the words that will be coming out of his mouth.
Well, and if we remember that the book of Revelation was written to 7 actual historical churches in Asia Minor, and they're all listed in chapters 2 and 3, and specific letters are written to each one of them. So even though it's highly symbolic and highly visionary, it is intended for real live Christians in the first century. It's not just for 21st century people who want to have a workshop on the end times. And what's also interesting is that in chapter 1, before the chapter is over, he explains every one of these symbols. He says the lampstands are the 7 churches. He says the stars in the hands of this Jesus figure are the 7 angels of the 7 churches. And the word angel means messenger. And so they could be the pastors of the 7 churches. And that's a wonderful assurance that Jesus has you in his hands. He can squeeze you if you're misbehaving, but he can also protect you to be in his grip. And so the book itself explains these terms for us. And I think there's a wonderful message in the two-edged sword coming out of his mouth. I think what Jesus is here portraying throughout the whole book is that he has already won and that he's continuing to be the victor. So these people that he gets that he's sending letters to are persecuted. Every one of them indicate that they've got suffering of one kind or another in the letter that is addressed to them. But what he's assuring them of, don't cave in and give in to the enemy because you think they've got the upper hand. I am the victor. So hang on to me, continue to be faithful to me. And what he does is to say, and the way he's going to win his conquest is not with a metal sword, which was the most, as Anne said, the most efficient sword was one that was sharp on both sides, so you could go both ways to fight. But that comes out of his mouth. It's his word that is going to conquer people, his gospel. And that's what he's giving his church, is the gospel to preach. And that will overcome unbelief, that'll overcome impenitence, it'll overcome all the things that God wants to change in people's hearts so they can receive what he has given them through his son. So it's really kind of a neat first chapter. that kind of lays out the theme that you'll see running through the whole book, you know. And I know a lot of people are intimidated by the imagery in the book of Revelation, but I suggest do just one simple thing. Read it as a story and ask yourself who wins and who loses. Because Jesus and God win every battle. And about every 4 chapters, it recycles the story to show the battle that's going on from the time of his ascension to the time when he returns. And it looks like the Christian church and the representatives of the Christian church that are symbolized are going down for the count. But that's not how it ends. And then at the very end of the book, all of the enemies of God are thrown into a lake of fire. They're incinerated, they're destroyed, they're eliminated. And so it all starts here in the first chapter.
Very good. Well, if there are any other thoughts on that, otherwise, we will roll right into the gospel, which is from John. So this is, of course, the classic story of Thomas. But it begins before that, or kind of the lead up to Thomas is when Jesus appears to the disciples. He appears among them. He says, "Peace be with you." He showed them his hands and his side. The disciples are overjoyed, and then he breathes on them. And this breathing thing has always seemed odd to me. Every time I hear it, there's probably no answer to this, but did he just go, which is kind of the image I have in my head, which feels very strange to imagine them all standing there and Jesus just going,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is there an odd thing about the translation? Is that just my own goofy, I can't get over that, my own hang up? And did he do it just once among them all, or did he go in turn to every single one of them and just breathe normally, and that is the breath that was bestowed on them? And then following up, Thomas here, my translation says, "Now Thomas," parentheses, also known as Didymus. Why does he get this other name? Not everybody, I mean, a lot of people are given a second name, but then that name is brought up again. Is this a nickname? Is this his name in a different language? Yeah, why? What do we know about that name? And then my question is always, I've always asked this, is where was Thomas? Why wasn't he there with them the first time around? And there's probably no answer, but I'll always ask that question. So any insights you have on any of those, I would very much appreciate it.
Well, I looked up, I'll jump into the Thomas Didymus.
Okay.
The Aramaic word for twin is teoma.
Okay.
It is believed that he was just called the twin, and that the name Thomas is a derivative of Aramaic, which is teoma, and that the Greek word for twin is Didymus.
Oh, okay.
And that we don't even know what his name is. He was just always called the twin.
Oh,
So
really?
maybe he was a twin of another disciple, or maybe he was a twin of somebody who was part of the entourage, but he was just called the twin. That's
Oh, okay.
So it's kind of
There's a nickname. Simon is called Petros, and he's given nicknames, and so are some of the other disciples, and they're identified by maybe who their father was or so on. And here, everybody would know who Thomas was, and the twin. Now we don't know, as Ann said, who the twin is, but and we don't know why he wasn't there the first Sunday of Easter when they first saw him. But what I think is important to notice is that all of the disciples had a chance to touch Jesus, because on the first Sunday, according to Luke's gospel, he instructs them to touch him. So and they all had doubts. They didn't believe the women. They didn't believe that he had arisen. And they thought the ladies' reports and witnesses were just a bunch of old wives' tales. And so they are all doubters too. And nowhere does the scriptures call Thomas the doubter. If anything, it pictures him as courageous, because when Jesus is just before he comes back to raise Lazarus, he says, let's go to Jerusalem and see Lazarus because he's dead. And Tom and other people are saying, well, you just came from there. Don't you remember how threatened you were by those religious leaders? And Thomas says, let's go and die with him. And so he's not the doubting, sniveling weakling that a lot of times people portray him as. He was a much more complicated person. But he, so what he's asking for when he says to the disciples, unless I can put my hand in the nail holes and in the side, he's just asking for the same thing that they had a chance to do. And he said, I'll believe it too. You guys have had that chance. Okay, now I want equal treatment. And Jesus must have heard him, because Jesus is omnipresent after his resurrection. And so he hears what he's asking for. So he doesn't even have to ask Jesus. Jesus offers it to him on the second Sunday when he comes to him. So he reveals that he knows what Thomas is looking for, and he provides what he needs, so he'll also believe like the rest. Kind of neat. Oh, the breathing. The word spirit in the Old Testament is ruach, which also literally means wind or breath. And so in Hebrew or in Greek, if they were speaking Hebrew or Aramaic or something like that, I think when he breathes on them, he's kind of maybe implying a play on words here, that the spirit is coming to them. It's like when Jesus puts his fingers in the deaf man's ears and looks up to heaven and sighs. It's sign language, and there may be an element of that here in what he's trying to communicate to them, that you're receiving the Spirit, and the Spirit's going to enable you to do things that you never dreamed of doing. And that will happen after Pentecost, after his ascension.
I will say too that in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth and he formed Adam out of clay, he breathed life into him. That was the first creation. Now that Jesus has died and has rose, now that he is resurrected, he inaugurated, if that's the right word, the new creation. He breathed this new life into his disciples. And now they are going to go out and share this new way of living and this new adoration of the completion of God's promises to all people. So there's it sounds silly, breathed on them, but there's more to it than that we would recognize when we look back at the Old Testament and see it being fulfilled in the New.
Okay, makes sense.
And what is interesting is that Thomas responds positively to the physical demonstration that Jesus allows him to experience. And he says, my Lord and my God. And so conviction, and it will obviously be embellished by Pentecost, but already Jesus has reached into him and equipped him to believe and gives him that.
Yeah.
Well, there's one last phrase that people will hear when he says to Thomas, blessed are you, that you have believed because you have seen me, ? Then he says, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. And he doesn't say that those who haven't seen and believe are more blessed than Thomas. He just simply says there will be other people who will be blessed by not having seen me, but they will still come to faith. And that includes you and me and everybody who's come to faith through the testimony of the apostles. And I think sometimes people read a false competition into that phrase that isn't really there. And it's not a put down of Thomas and saying, well, you shouldn't have even asked for that, because that's exactly what the other disciples asked for.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think that's good. Well, it's a good spot to leave us on there, unless there are any other final thoughts. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us this week. We appreciate you joining us and every week. Please join us again next week. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time on Talking Sunday Readings. Bye now.